Today we're going to take a look at beaded knitting. So to start with, what is beaded knitting? Basically, it's just adding beads as embellishments as you are knitting your piece. So you could sew on beads afterwards, but what we're looking at is the methods of incorporating the beads into your piece as you're knitting it. And there are a couple of options of how to approach this. One way is to add the beads to the stitches one at a time as you're knitting the work. And usually people will use a small crochet hook, or there's other methods of doing that. The other method is to string all of the beads that you're going to use for your piece onto the yarn before you start knitting it. And then the beads are on that yarn that you're using for your knitting, and you just add them in place as you go. There are a couple of different reasons you might choose one method or the other. One is how the beads actually appear on the piece, because if you're working them as you go, where you're using a crochet hook, generally they end up kind of vertically aligned over the stitch because you're putting it over both legs of your stockinette stitch. So this shawl is an example of that. It's worked in stockinette stitch, and the beads go over the stitch, so they're aligned with the stitches. If you are pre-stringing your beads, there are a few different ways that the beads could show up. If you want them to be vertically aligned like this, one way is to do them next to a yarn over so that they're sitting on the leg of the stitch, but it's kind of got a little hole to put in it, and that makes it fairly close, but you do get some little holes in the fabric. Another way, if you want them to sit horizontally to the stitch, would be to do a slip stitch a slip stitch with the yarn held in front, and then you put the bead in front of the stitch, so then it's kind of hanging by a little string in front of the stitch, and you don't see it from the back. And then another method would be to just add the bead as you're knitting the stitch onto one leg or the other. And if you're working in stockinette stitch, because the stockinette stitch makes kind of a V shape, your beads in that method are going to be diagonally placed. So either you'll put it on the right leg of the stitch and it will lean slightly to the right, or the left leg and it would lean the other way to what we're showing here. So another method, which is what we're going to do actually for this box, is to do the pre-stringing method, but actually work it in garter stitch. And the beads are placed in between stitches, and they're going to sit horizontally to the fabric. So they have a nice kind of grid layout. They're not on the diagonal like they would be in a stockinette stitch, and they're showing only on the front of the fabric. So the back of the fabric, the beads don't show up. So this is nice if you're making a garment or something where you're going to be feeling the inside, that they sit only on the front and not showing through the back like you see here. Some other considerations just practically in terms of which method you might choose. If you're putting the beads on each stitch individually as you go with the crochet hook method, you need to be carrying around your beads with you and have your crochet hook ready and be in a spot where you're not going to be disturbed or spill any beads throughout the whole project. Whereas if you're pre-stringing the beads, you can put all of the beads that you need for the whole project onto your yarn all at once. You do need to have some focused, quiet time to do that, but once you've got them all on, your project is much more portable. You can take it on the bus, you can do whatever you want with it. You're not going to be spilling beads all over the place. One disadvantage or another thing to consider about the pre-stringing method is just that it does create a little bit of abrasion when you pull the bead along the string of yarn. So we'll see that in a minute, how we're going to be pulling the beads along the yarn. So if you're working with a very delicate yarn or a bead that has slightly sharp edges, you might want to choose the method where you're putting them on one at a time, just to not create damage to the yarn through the abrasion of the beads. So another thing that you want to think about when you're planning your beaded knitting project would be what types of beads you're going to use and what the size is. So if you have beads made of wood or other natural materials like these ones, they don't usually come in standard sizes, and you're just going to have to get some beads and test them out with the yarn that you are using and make sure that the holes are big enough that the yarn will go through. If you're using more beads like this, these kinds of seed beads or glass beads, they tend to come with more standard sizing. So you can get them in, often comes in vials like this, and they'll have a size marked on them. So bead sizing, the smaller the size, the bigger the bead. So size 6 is usually about the largest of the seed beads, the glass beads that you'll find. They go up to size, I think, 13 or 15, which is very, very tiny. We're using with size 8, so they're still fairly large, but they're not as big as the 6s. These ones are 6s here, the slightly bigger, and these ones that we're going to be working with for this project are size 8. You'll also see sizing on beading needles, so we're going to get to beading needles and how to get the yarn or the beads on the yarn in a moment. Beading needles also a similar principle that the larger the size, the smaller the needle. So a size 10 needle is going to be bigger than a size 13 needle. So to get started with our beaded knitting box, we're going to start with actually a really tiny mini swatch to just practice getting the beads onto the yarn, because there's a couple of different methods that we can use for that, and then just see how they work with the fabric, and then we'll get into making more complex designs like this. So to start with, we need to string the beads for this little pattern onto our yarn. So that means we're going to do it in a pattern of 3 purple, 3 green, 3 purple. And I'm going to show you a couple of different methods of doing that so that you can choose the one that works best for you. So in your box, you'll get a beading needle. This is a standard beading needle, and you can see that it has a very tiny eye. So there's no way that we're going to get our nice sport weight yarn through the tiny eye of that needle. So as a bridge between the needle and the yarn, we're just going to use a little loop of sewing thread. So I'll show you how to set that up. We need just a small amount of thread. It doesn't have to be long. And then we're going to thread that through our needle. You can see it might take a minute because it's a small eye, but I've got it there. And then the method that Galina, who is our featured designer for this box, uses is actually to thread both ends through the needle to make a loop. I find that's a bit tricky because it's such a small eye, and it also means that they can come out. You could accidentally pull both ends out while you're using it. And I prefer actually to make just a small knot. You can make an overhand knot. And the beads that we're using are big enough that they'll easily go over that knot. And then you have a kind of a more permanent loop there. So we have our loop of sewing thread. And then we're just going to put the very end of our yarn through that loop like this. So now we kind of have a sequence of beading needle, thread, yarn, all attached together. And we can start threading our beads. I put my beads out here on actually a swatch that's left over from a different project. Galina recommends using a beading mat just because if you put the beads straight onto a tabletop or something, a hard surface, they tend to roll around. You have missing beads, you have beads on the floor. Having them on something that has a bit of texture keeps them in place and makes them less likely to escape. So we're going to put our first 3 beads, so 3 purple to match our pattern. And then they're just going to go from the needle over the thread. When you get to the yarn, it's a bit thicker, so you're going to have to pull a little bit harder, but it shouldn't be too tough to get them across. So you're just going to pull them across. And then once you get to the single yarn here where it's not doubled anymore, they should move pretty easily along the thread. So I've got my 3 purple. I'm going to do the same thing here, picking up 3 green. I would say if you are using a swatch as a mat, don't use a fuzzy yarn because that will be frustrating. You'll end up picking up the yarn with the beads with your sharp little needle. But a fairly smooth yarn, it works well. So we've got the 3 green going onto the yarn. I can push them down to go next to the purple ones here. And then 3 purple, and that's going to be our first little row of beads. I'm going to show you another method, so we're going to put this beading needle aside for now. Another way that we can get the beads on is to use what's called a big eye needle. So this is a needle that's basically two flexible pieces of wire that are attached, you can see, at both ends. So it makes a big loop. And then because it's got this big loop in the middle, that's the eye of the needle, you can just put the yarn straight through. You don't need to mess with sewing thread. So these needles come in different lengths, so you might get one in your kit that's smaller or larger, depending on which one you gets thrown into your kit, but they all work the same way, no matter how long they are. And so now you've got your yarn attached to your needle, and you can just pick up the beads like normal. So 1, 2, 3, and then you'll have to pull it to get it over the yarn like we did before. And again, the green. 1, 2, 3. Gently tug it to get them over. One consideration with the big eye needles is just that they are more fragile than the regular beading needles. So if you pull too hard or if your yarn is too thick, it can actually break the connection here. The two wires would split apart and then your needle is not functional anymore. It's broken. You can't use it. So you do have to be a little bit careful with that end there. And the other thing that may or may not be more frustrating to you is that it is a lot more flexible than a normal beading needle. So depending on how your technique for picking up beads is working, you might find it a little trickier to get the beads onto the big eye needle. So we've got, this is our first row, our second row, and then we're going to do one more row to make this little tiny swatch. And I'm going to show you the last method for now. I'm actually going to use the other end of my yarn, but we'll come back to this in a minute because I've set it up. This is a method that is, if you don't have access to a beading needle for some reason and you want to get started with your project right away, or if you're finding the needles to be just frustrating to use, you can't get them threaded, your big eye needle breaks, whatever, this is another option where you actually kind of make your yarn into its own beading needle. So this is just the end of the yarn that has been glued with white glue. We'll apply some white glue and then twisted as tight as possible and then let to dry so that it hardens. So you've got a nice stiff tip and it's as thin as you can get it. And then you can actually just use that to go directly into your beads. So this, I find, it's not as easy to pick up multiple beads at once, but once you get them on, they're on. So we'll do 1, 2, oops. There goes a bead. There we go. 1, 2, 3. And then you would switch to your other color here. So as you can see, there's easier and trickier parts to all of these methods, and you're welcome to try all of them and find the one that works best for you. I'm going to just show, if you do want to use the method of gluing the tip of your yarn to create kind of its own needle, how we would do that. So I'm just using plain white glue, and I've got my yarn tip here that I've, this one is kind of like it's been broken rather than cut sharp. So if you cut a sharp end, you kind of will get more of a blunt needle. And here it's tapered a little bit, so it's going to be a little pointier at the end. Oops. And I've just got my glue. I'm going to dab on a little bit here. We want it to be pretty well penetrated into the yarn, so a good amount of glue. And then you need to wash your hands after this for sure. We can twist it up to try and make it nice and thin, and then just let that dry. And you want to let it dry for probably a couple hours just to make sure that it's really stiff. If you try and use it before it's totally dry, it's not going to work very well. And once it is dry, if you find like this might be actually too thin at the tip, you could just cut it off with a pair of scissors to get a nice point at the end where you're going to stick it into the beads. I'm going to show you now how to actually work the beads into your knitting. So we're still working on this little swatch here, and we've got our 3 groups of beads that match. So each group has 3 purple, 3 green, 3 purple. So each row has its own little set of beads. And for this method, we're actually going to place the beads on the side of the work that's facing away from us. So that means the beads are being placed on the wrong side rows. So we're going to start just by knitting the first couple of stitches to give us a little bit of an edge here. So I'm going to knit 1, 3, and then I'm going to bring these beads a little bit closer to where I'm working on the needle, and I'm going to pull the first one all the way up to be snug next to the stitch that I just worked. So the beads are actually going to go in between the knit stitches. So it's nice and snug there. I can work my next knit stitch as normal, and you can see that I have 3 stitches, a bead, and then my 4th stitch. So I'm going to place another bead. We're going to bring it up snug next to the needle and knit the next stitch. My next bead up next to the needle and knit the next stitch. Now I want a little bit of space between my colors here, so I'm going to knit 2 plain stitches. And then I'm going to bring the green one up next to the needle. So we've already put these on the yarn in the right order, in the order that we need. So they're ready and waiting for us. So 1, 2, 3 green beads. And then I'm going to knit 2 more stitches in between. And then I'll just show this one. If we want to hold the yarn in the left hand, you can actually use your right index finger just to pull the bead to where you want it. Knit the next stitch. Make sure we just have 1 bead here. They're getting a little close. Here we go. Pull the next stitch in, or next bead, knit the next stitch, pull the bead snug, knit the next stitch, and then last 2 will just be plain stitches at the end here. And then, so you see we don't see any beads from this side. This is the wrong side of the work. We flip it over and there are our nice beads all sitting horizontally on the stitches. The next row we're going to knit, and this is just a plain knit row. So what we're going to do is just push our beads out of the way because we don't need any beads on this row. We just need some yarn to knit with. And then we're going to knit the whole row normally. So when you get to where a bead is, you can see it's sitting in between those stitches on the needle, and you just keep going. Don't do anything at all with the beads on the right side row. You'll just need to keep moving the beads that you've already strung out of the way to make sure you have enough yarn to complete the row. So that's it for the bead placement. It's really pretty simple. The things that you'll need to kind of keep into account are making sure that you get the beads exactly where you want. So we'll look at that in a second by looking at how to look at the charts, how to read charts, and the stringing instructions, and making sure that you know where the beads are going to go in your knitting to get the pattern that you want. So now that we've looked at how we're going to get the beads into the knitted project, I want to talk about creating motifs, because that's one of the most fun, but also a little bit tricky parts of beaded knitting is deciding where the beads go to create the design that you want on your knitting. So we're going to work right now, we're going to look at working from a chart that has the bead placement on it. For this box, I'm made a little swatch that has 3 different beaded motifs. You can choose to do just 1, 2, or 3, many as you like. You don't have to do all of them. You could just choose your favorite as a way to practice. But I have them all charted out here so that you can follow them on the chart. The first thing to notice when we look at the chart, we'll look at the chart key. So each square here, the white squares are just plain knit stitches. The green squares are place a bead in color A and knit 1. So it's showing you're placing a bead and you're knitting a stitch. And then the same thing for the purple one, we're placing the second color, the purple, and knitting a stitch. So we have a 36 stitches total. You have 1 square for each stitch, and the colors just show you where you're placing a bead before the stitch that you're going to work. The other thing to note about the way this chart is set up is that each of these rows of squares actually represents 2 rows of knitting. So it's 1 garter ridge. So you're going to be working always on the wrong side to place the beads, then knitting a plain row back, and then the next row here is the next garter ridge, so it's also a wrong side row, and then knitting back on a plain row. Because we're working from the wrong side, another key thing to note is that the way that your motifs in the beads are going to appear on your knitting is actually going to be a mirror image of how they appear on the chart, because we're going to be knitting this way across the chart, and then we flip it over and it's going to be, you can see here, so my little chevrons are going the opposite way here. This one is a totally symmetrical design, so you don't see any difference. And then here you see as well the thicker diagonal is going to the left here and to the right on the chart. So once you've decided on which motif you're going to work first, you need to string the beads onto your yarn before you start knitting with it. You can either follow the chart, or we are going to give also a list for the bead stringing for which order to put the colors in, but I'm going to look at the chart first. So the beads always have to be strung in reverse order from how you're going to knit them. So if we're knitting from the bottom here, this way, all the way to the top, we would start stringing at the top and do 2 green, 1 purple, 2 green, 1 purple, 2 green would be our first stringing ridge for this motif. Then the next row, we have 3 green, they're not next to each other, but they're 3 in a row, 2 purple, 3 green, 2 purple, 3 green. That would be our next row of knitting with the beads. So we can go through the chart and make sure that we string them always from left to right and bottom to top to make sure we get them in the right order. You might want to, if you're doing it from the chart, make an extra copy of the chart and then just cross it off as you go so that you know you've done that row. And it's also handy when you're getting them onto the yarn, you might want to leave some space, put all of the beads together for one row in next to each other, but then leave some space between the next row so that you can go back and double check if you need to recount. And the same thing would be if we were going to make one of these motifs. This one here, we would start with 1 green, 1 purple, 1 green, then 3 green, 3 purple, 3 green for the next row, always from left to right and top to bottom. If that is a little bit confusing to you or you don't want to work from the chart, we also have the stringing list, which gives you just a list of which beads to string and in what order. So if we're working on the first motif here, we start with row 16, right? Because we are always starting with the furthest away from us. So we're going to start with ridge 16, and ridges 16 to 12 are all the same order. So we're going to repeat this 5 times, to get the right number of beads. And then we're switching the order of the beads and doing it again 5 times to get the right order of beads there. If we're working on the second motif, we're starting at ridge 27. So remember, each of these rows of squares represents one garter ridge. So this is ridge 27, 26, and it's got a list of which beads, A, B, A, 3A, 3B, 3A, all the way down to ridge 21 is the bottom for this one. And then the same thing for the zigzag flower motif. You're starting at row 37 because it's the top row, and you've got a list of what order to string your beads in. So I'm just going to do a quick demo of the last couple of rows of this beaded motif so I can show you a couple of things about following the chart. So as I mentioned, we've pre-strung our beads from the top to the bottom. So I have 2 rows or 2 ridges left to work here. So this is the end of the yarn that's attached to the ball. And so you can see I have my 2 green, 1 purple, 2 green, 1 purple, 2 green for that row. And then this row, we have 3 green, 2 purple, 3 green, 2 purple, 3 green. So those are my beads for the last 2 ridges. And I've got my work here ready. I'm going to start on the wrong side where I'm going to be placing the beads for ridge 36. So I can look at my chart. Ridge 36, I have 5 squares here that are just the plain right squares. So those are 5 plain knit stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I'm going to place my first bead. I'm going to bring these a little bit closer so that I have them available. Place my first bead and then knit the next stitch. So that is that green square, place bead and knit the stitch. Then I have 1 white square next to it, so that's a plain knit stitch. And then here I got 2 place the green bead and knit. So I'm going to place that green bead, knit the stitch, place the green bead, knit the stitch. Now I just wanted to show, looking at it a little bit closer from this side, so we only see 1 white square between the 2 beads, but we actually on our work see 2 knit stitches because the bead comes before the knit stitch. So we place and knit, that's part of that first square or the green square, and then this one is the white square. So anywhere where you see white squares between the beads, you're actually going to have 1 extra stitch above the number of the squares that you have there. So I'll show that again just to make it clear. So I've done my 2 green. So green, place green, knit, place green, knit. And then we're going to knit 2 white, 1, 2. Then we're going to place the purple and knit. So we look at our work, we see green, white, white, purple, but we actually have green, white, white, white in terms of the stitches. We have green, 1, 2, 3 stitches, purple, and then another knit stitch. And the same thing here, in between here, I made my place bead and knit. We have 1 plain knit, then place bead and knit. And again, you'll see, even though there's 1 white square here, we see 2 white stitches in between the beads. And I'll just actually show the other side right now. I won't bother to finish this row, but you can see, you can always check on the other side of the work to make sure that you're lining up with the rows below you. So you can see you've got your diagonal line is in the right place, and you're making this little V to make the V the shape of the flower, and you've got those stitches in the right place on this side. So now that we have the hang of reading charts, placing our beads, getting everything in the right order, I want to just talk about some troubleshooting ideas if you run into a couple of specific issues. So one of them would be if you go to work your next row of beads and realize that, oops, you've threaded them in the wrong order, or maybe you're missing a bead. That, because, you know, if you're doing a whole bunch of beads at once, you might find out afterwards that you don't quite have exactly what you need on the yarn. So if that happens, you don't have to panic. If you're at the end of a row here, you could just cut the yarn, take the beads off, go back to your beading needle, rethread them in the way that you need, and put them back on. So not a big deal. You just have a couple of extra ends to weave in later. Something that might happen that's a little bit harder to deal with would be if you get to this row and you realize that either there's a knot or a slub in the yarn that the beads won't go over, so you can't push them over onto the next section, or if you misjudged how much yarn you need and you have come to the end of your ball of yarn and you need to attach a new one. So if you run into that issue and you've already got a whole lot of beads threaded, you don't want to rethread them, one option would be to do a splice in the yarn so that you can push the beads over it and you don't need to rethread them. So I'm going to just show you quickly how to do a basic wet splice. So this only works with a non-superwash wool. So if you're using an acrylic yarn or cotton or a superwash wool, this is probably not a good idea and you might just end up having to rethread your beads. But if you're using a non-superwash wool, this is a nice non-superwash blue face luster that we're working with here, you don't need to rethread them if you can do a splice. If you want to do a splice in your yarn, you need a couple of things. So you need a blunt darning needle. It's not super necessary, but it's useful. A pair of scissors to get your yarn, and you need a little bit of water. Some people call this spit splicing, and you could actually use your own spit if you're really in a desperate situation, but for hygiene reasons, we're gonna just use some plain water. So we're gonna cut here where we want the splice. So if you had a knot or something, you'd cut out the knot. And then this is a 3-ply yarn, and we want to just separate the plies from each other. So we're gonna use the needle here. Its purpose is just to go in between the plies of the yarn and untwist them. So you can do some untwisting by hand and using the needle. And you want to do this for maybe 1.5 inches or so. It doesn't have to be a big section. So we've got our 3 plies all separated. Then we're going to get the end of the yarn that we're joining to, and we're going to do the same thing. I find if we untwist it a little bit first and then put the needle in to open up the plies. There we go. I have to do it a couple of times to really untwist them. So we now have 2 ends of yarn that have an untwisted section of about the same length as each other. The next step, we don't want to create a big bump. If we just splice these together, we'd have like a double thickness here. So to avoid having a double thickness of yarn, we're going to stagger where the end points are. So I'm going to take those 3 ends and I'm going to cut them at different lengths. So one of them is going to be a little bit shorter. One of them is even shorter, close to where it's still twisted. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the other side. Open it up, cut off one, cut another one, quite close to the end here. So now, when I match them up, I put them together. There's lots of overlap of the different lengths, but we don't have a double thickness of yarn here. The next step is just to get a little bit of water. This is the wet splicing part. And we're going to dab it together. Hold these together, put a little bit of water on them. And then simply roll them back and forth. So this is felting the fibers together a little bit. And we can do this for a couple minutes. It takes a few minutes. It's not going to be long time, but you want to make sure that you're really giving them time to adhere to each other. So I'll keep going a little bit longer. So now I have my splice and my yarn. It's not super pretty. There's like a little bit of a slub here, but it's reasonably strong and it should be thin enough that I can get my beads over top of it. So here I've got to the splice. There's a little bit of a bump there, but I can just pull my beads all the way onto my new section of yarn. So that's a good option. If you don't like weaving in ends, you could always do this just as an alternative, or if you need to start a new skein of yarn or cut out a knot or another problem section in your yarn. So when I was doing this swatch, I did not thread all of the beads for all of the motifs at once, because that becomes a lot of beads to be pushing down along the yarn at once. It's kind of annoying to do, and it also is increasing the amount of abrasion on the yarn. So I actually threaded the beads for the first section, then I broke the yarn, threaded the beads for the next section after this one. So I knit these, break the yarn, thread these ones, and then spliced it back together and then kept knitting, and I did the same thing for the last one. So I was only working with the beads for one motif at a time rather than trying to push all of those beads along the yarn as I was knitting.